Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds. I'm Nerdic Steve. Today I'm joined by Douglas Cole. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing as well as can be expected in the continuation of 2020 that is 2021.
Yeah, 2020 part two.
Ugh.
Someday we'll get out of the
Some
2020.
sequels are not better than the original.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this one started interesting with an action scene at any rate.
Indeed.
Um, so for people that are not familiar with you and what you do, you want to give us the elevator pitch?
Absolutely. So I'm Douglas Cole. I'm the Chief Everything Officer of Gaming Ballistic. I am an independent game publishing and creation company. Mostly my work over the last few years has been licensed from Steve Jackson Games. I am the only third-party publisher that does powered by no, I'm sorry. I'm the only third party publisher that does fantasy trip material, and I think I'm one of two or three. The one that I'm definitely aware of being Amarillo Design Bureau. They have a Starfleet Battles Universe Prime Directive game, but I'm one of the very few third party publishers allowed to work with the Powered by GURPS and Fantasy Trip properties. I also have some OGL material, a game that I wrote called Dragon Heresy, which shares the setting with my Dungeon Fantasy role playing game material. And I'm probably best known as the grappling guy because I wrote a book. My first Kickstarter was for a book called Dungeon Grappling, which it's a low bar, but the elevator pitch on that one is grappling rules that don't suck.
Are they super complex though?
They're not, and that's the thing is that uh, if you can do so, sword fighting in real life and punchy kicky in real life is complex. Anyone who has actually done it knows that it is technical and there are lots of variations and all the historical European fencing manuals by Fiore and Talhofer and George Silver and those guys, they're really intricate, but we are willing, able, and eager to accept roll 1d20 plus a bonus against an armor class if you hit do damage. And that's the level of abstraction you really want in a fast playing game. Grappling has always been treated as something else. Oh my God, we need flowcharts, we need whatever, whatever. But what I did is roll 1d20 plus a bonus against a grapple DC, which is sort of a touch proxy for an armor class, and then if you hit roll damage, and the damage type is control. The more control points you have, the more tied up your foe is. If you want to do a big throw or break the guy's arm or whatever, you can spend some of those earned points in order to do cool things. So at the core, it's very simple because it's the mechanic we've all grown up with since 1970 something. Roll 1d20 against plus a bonus against an armor class or against a table and do damage if you hit. And once you unify grappling with the main combat system, um, a lot of synergy and kind of easy rolling is easy play really is can be enabled. So that was my first book. It's actually sold pretty well, and it was a derivative of my very first published book, uh, GURPS Martial Arts Technical Grappling, um, which I then re-released in like 1/7 the page count because I figured out how to use fewer words to tell the same story.
Now, if my memory serves me correct, you were I imagine probably not so much now, but before the end times, you were doing like a Viking martial arts or something.
And I'm still doing it some. I actually ran for a while a Viking fitness class to help keep our shield arms engaged.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a school that tries to recreate um, how the Vikings might have fought based on accurate reproductions of the period materials, and I got into making shields and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun, and I had done some Korean martial arts over time, in my past, but I'd never really done Western stuff, and using shield and sword and stuff like that was a real eye opener for me in terms of what games get right and get wrong and how it works, and get wrong is that's the wrong way to phrase it, but
Yeah.
where the rules enable cool stuff that looks like what it might look like. And the thing that impressed me about all that was really how active the shield gets used in reality versus it just sort of sits there as a +1 or +2 to armor class in a lot of systems. But you do cool things with the shield. And that's where to tie it in, that's where the dungeon grappling can come in, because you can grapple the other person with the shield. You press it against them. You work on their shield to open up defenses. You push the edge of the shield into their arm to make it so they can't hit you. Stuff like that.
Yeah, like I guess the thing they don't really show in movies and other forms of media is, what I would like to call dirty boxing
Sure.
aspect of fighting. When you're in close and you can't really do these big swings, and
Right.
you never really see half swording and see anyone turn their sword around and use the hilt and the pommel as a warhammer instead of
Right.
swinging and stabbing.
And the funny thing about that one, of course, is the murder stroke and some of the half sorting is pretty cool.
Yeah.
You could make a pretty good fight scene out of that. The problem with it is usually that if you admit that, especially a one-handed or sword or whatever, is not actually going to cut through chainmail or plate, and it's just gonna bounce.
Yeah.
You've just undid the canon of almost every fighting fantasy show ever, where armor is really just a costume and you can cut right through it and all that. But
The reality is closer to two metal guys or two guys bashing each other with metal sticks until they can knock one down.
Yeah, and then I mean, but the that is true. It can be, but what they do then is they grapple.
Yeah.
And it's not, they don't just sit there trading blows. It's very intricate and it's very cool, and you could do a lot with it. It's just, you don't necessarily expect to see someone half sorting and then using the pommel to hook around the back of the neck and then stepping behind and throwing someone down, locking them out, and then stabbing them with a rondel dagger in the faceplate. That would make a pretty dynamic scene, but it requires, I think, different thinking on the part of the people making the movies and doing the blocking and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that knowledgeable on it. I know, like, my partner Ted, my brother-in-law, he had done armor-esque training for a while. And I say Arma because, like, they weren't actually affiliated with Arma. They just went off the manuals and text on that stuff. And, he kind of opened my eyes to a lot of that stuff. And, I had done some research and found some YouTube videos of people grappling, right, in armor,
Right.
which were pretty cool. And also like him explaining to me, like, yeah, they would use the sword as a warhammer to bash the joints, because if you can lock someone's joint out, they can't use it. And like ultimately the goal is just to kind of knock the other guy down so you can finish him off with a dagger.
Right. And assuming, and this is where D&D and a lot of fantasy games go different ways, that downed knight is worth an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
Equipping a knight and putting that armor in. The horses, the horses are not like going out and getting a Yugo. The horses are like going out and getting an Audi R8. These are highly trained, specialized fighting machines that people would pay the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a good one. So anyway, it's sort of it's taking the other guy for ransom and not killing him. Again, there's the grappling part of it.
Yeah.
So, but
I imagine too, especially if you're like a nobody, right? Like that could make your whole family for
right,
the next several generations.
right. And so it's interesting, and the subtleties of, or the things, the gameplay elements that, not just sorting or stabbing everyone to death, uh, opens up by allowing sort of the mixed fantasy arts, is I think there's a lot there that
Yeah.
people's frustration with the assumed complexity of grappling rules opens up. I actually was talking to somebody on Ten Cars Tavern Discord, where he was talking about that, where he bought Dungeon Grappling, and his player who plays a monk loves it because he gets to do all kinds of cool stuff, and it's opened up some gameplay elements and some side plots and stuff that he just feels like would never have existed.
Well, when you ask questions and start looking for the answers, it does. You never know where they're going to lead you all the time. So
That is
it just adds to new story elements
that's
to
right.
explore.
That's right. Yeah,
So you've got a Kickstarter launching, and as
I
always,
do.
folks, links are in the description down below for Fantasy Trip. What is Fantasy Trip?
So Fantasy Trip is one of the original tactical role-playing games. It started as a tactical battle game called Melee. Um, and that came out kind of contemporaneously with some of the original D&D editions. I believe the In the Labyrinth book and the Fantasy Trip were really published around 1980. Um, and it was hex-based, tactical, still used the 5-second turn, but it really embraced the map-based combat. But it was a fairly rules-light game. It had a lot of wargaming elements, but character generation was assign 32 points among a couple of attributes, and then you fight. And you could either just do gladiator style arena combat, or later there was a book called In the Labyrinth, that unified the wizard rules, the melee rules, and added significant role play elements. But it was published and popular in the early 80s. And Steve Jackson wrote it with, I believe, Metagaming. Um, Forgive me if I get some of the details wrong. But he lost the rights to it because he was writing for another company. But he, through the complexities of copyright law, he was able to reacquire those rights and release the Legacy Edition, a spectacularly huge, packed box of stuff, and that came out in 2019. So it took almost 40 years for him to, he had to wait 3 decades, I think, to get those rights back, and then he released it with a vengeance. And so let me just take one thing, right? So this is the freaking box that it came with. This is magnificent. Look at the size of this thing, right? That's no moon, it's a space station.
Nice. Hold it like in front of your face, kind of.
Right. This I am holding in front of my face.
Yeah, no,
It's that big.
in
It's
front of you
sideways, right? Oh yeah.
because of the there you go. Because I have you in a box.
Okay,
There you
okay,
can
okay,
see it
okay.
better.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah,
Yeah. So
that is
it's
a big box.
it's a big box, and it comes with the inside. It is packed with stuff, and you've got In the Labyrinth, you've got Melee, you've got Wizard, you've got Tullencolor's Lair, you've got Death Test, many of the original materials that came along with that box were inserted in it, and you get a lot of stuff. Punch out mega hexes that you can lay down to make your dungeon, and so for people who are looking for, it's still a no defense roll system, but for people who sort of trace lineage, you can see how TFT led to man, led to GURPS very clearly. But it is its own thing, and it is very light, and you can write up a couple of characters and be bashing each other with swords and sticks and axes and stuff in a couple minutes. which has a lot of appeal. It supports strongly solo play. And there are a couple of solo adventures published by Steve Jackson Games, and now three more published by Gaming Ballistic. So we've got Dragon Hunt, and Dark Lord's Vampire Hunter Belladonna, yeah, and Dark Lord's Doom. Little gratuitous promo shots here.
Yeah.
All three of these are written by David Pulver for Gaming Ballistic under license, and they've been very well received by TFT players. I think David did a fantastic job, well, on all three really, but Dragon Hunt and Dark Lord's Doom are truly special. And not only do they support solo play, but they actually support, they're really less solo adventures than programmed adventures where you and several of your friends can each take a character. And by the way, if you're playing Dragon Hunt, take several characters, because playtesting revealed that it is a meat grinder. Oh my God, if you try and do that solo, that is playing Dragon Hunt on hard mode.
So, were you a fan of Fantasy Trip back in the day? Did you come to it later?
I came to it later, actually. The story of how we I started working with Fantasy Trip. I have always been a GURPS fan, and when the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game came out, I've been playing GURPS since 1989. When the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game came out, I had started Gaming Ballistic as a company doing dungeon grappling like we talked about, and some 5e and OSR stuff. But when Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game came out, their powered by GURPS box set, I was there at Gen Con 50 when it was released, and I sat down with Steve actually the year later. I know what it was. I talked to those guys and said, I have an adventure called Lost Hall of Tyr that I'm running here at Gen Con 50. I could easily turn that into support for the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game. And their response, as is proper, was, yeah, talk to me later.
Yeah.
But I did, and I held my breath, and I eventually talked to them. I said, can I do this? And they're like, well, what are the risks? I said, well, not much, because the art exists, the writing exists. I'd have to convert it to the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game, but I've been playing GURPS for a long time. And I've already run 3 Kickstarters successfully. So, I'm a project manager by trade. That's what I do. So I think the risks for you are pretty low. And they're like, okay, fine. So then I came forward with Hall of Judgment. I genericized it a little bit because it is a generic universal role-playing game. And that led me to my Nordland setting for the Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game. So I sat down with Steve at GameholeCon, and I said, what can I do that I'm not doing with Steve Jackson Games? And he said, and Steve is like the most laconic man on the face of the planet, right? He's very terse. He said, write for TFT. I said, let me think about that, because I had never played TFT. Actually, that's not true. I had played TFT that morning for the first time.
You're an expert.
Yeah, right, exactly. But so write for TFT, and I said, well, I don't just want to say yes. I have to think about this, because I don't want to do something and be bad at it, right? I want it to be good. Steve Jackson Games wants me to write material that is good. Everyone wants me to write material that is good if they're going to pay for it, especially. But so I talked to some people who had written for TFT before: David Pulver, Christopher R. Rice, J. Edward Tremlett, his writing partner. And I thought, well, instead of me trying to do it, maybe I'll get people who have done it before to do it, and that will increase the credibility of the initial offering. And so I went back and I said, yes, all right. I went to the authors and said, give me a couple of proposals each, and I'll pick the best 1 or 2 of those proposals and submit them to Steve Jackson Games. And so I talked to Elaine Dawson, the licensing manager, and that's my point of contact. And I said, okay, here's 10 proposals that my authors have submitted. Which 2 do you really want? And they came back and said, yes.
Nice.
Okay. So they liked them, I liked them, and we sketched out uh, a tour de force of okay, how are we going to bring this? And I was like, I don't want to do 10 books at once. That's crazy talk. So we said we'll do five, and that became what I said was I'll do four, and that became what was originally the Four Perilous Journeys Kickstarter. Um, but I in the middle of the campaign, I was like, people sort of poked at me like, are we really sure that these four books are worth what you're charging? And I looked, I'm like, well, yeah, but I understand that for a Kickstarter, you expect a deal, and so I can't undo the pricing. But what I can do is offer a fifth book. So Four Perilous Journeys became Five Perilous Journeys, and David, on a very tight schedule, wrote me a 32-page solo adventure, The Vampire Hunter Belladonna, and that became part of the Kickstarter and what people would get as part of their pledge. And then mid-campaign, I got the opportunity to participate in the Decks of Destiny project with Steve Jackson Games, and they said, hey, if you want to, you can offer these cards. And they were very kind to me in terms of how the support they provided. And all of a sudden, I've never seen a Kickstarter, especially my Kickstarter, not do the initial buy, pretty boring, and then oh my god at the end. So I offered these cards and these punch out counters mid campaign, and the velocity just went crazy, and it was a very successful campaign for me, my most successful ever. um, and so uh, the it went very well, and so clearly I was going to do more. I did some Dungeon Fantasy role playing game stuff first, but in the middle of all that 2020 happened, and things took longer, and so I just sent out all of the print copies for the second set of books. I showed you a couple of covers already, but those included two new solos by David, longer solos, as well as the continuation of the campaign arc by Christopher and J. Edward Tremlett that started in the fourth. So that was called More Perilous Journeys. I've told people that all of my TFT Kickstarters are not going to involve the word peril. But maybe they will. I don't know. This
We don't,
next
we
one
don't
is
have any
actually, yeah,
evidence of that yet.
right, yeah. So, but the next one tomorrow is called character collections. One of the things that I realized as I was writing the Sunken Library, this guy here, was that there were a bunch of places where the there were a bunch of places in the text where it said, "Oh, and now you're fighting eight 32-point characters, or you're attacked by bandits," and the usual thing to do is say, "Here's a typical stat block for bandits," and now you're basically fighting 8 to 12 clones, and that's easy to do, but
Mhm.
it's less interesting, and so I included a bunch of stats for bandits and bad guys and this and that in the back of the book, which increased the length of it well beyond the planned page count. Um,
So
but then I
there's
was like,
variants. Can
right,
we back up a little bit for people that are not familiar with the system, and
absolutely,
kind of give them a little bit of a rundown?
yeah.
Who this game would kind of appeal to.
So I would say that the fantasy trip, and really you should pop in on the fantasy trip Discord, um, and we can put that in a comment block later, and talk to people who have been playing this game for 40 years now. But the fantasy trip, I think, appeals to people who want a little bit more tactical resolution in what is still a rules like game. And it's it's got there are only a couple of stats: strength, dex, and IQ. It's point based to character generation, so you'll assign 32 points for that. Armor, absorbs hits of damage, which is the way that it does in GURPS and Dragon Heresy as well. There's also a damage reduction variant in Pathfinder and 5e that allows for that. But yeah, it's a combat game where you have different moves. You have movement phase and then an attack phase, and if you do certain things during the attack phase, your opponent can respond in a different way. It's still one roll hit resolution, but it just takes the resolution of the combat a little bit finer. The other thing is that um, I think characters are, it's more of an old school feel because like your hit points, so to speak, are based on your strength. And when you're hit, if you have strength 12, you have 12 hits. And if you get hit 12 injury, you're done, you're dead or mortally wounded or whatever, which is a lot like the old, really, how many hit dice do you have OSR, and less like the, I'm a barbarian with 300 hit points and resistance. So you
Yeah.
just, kind of whack at me all day or whatever. So it tends to play fast, and because combat is so deadly and the game master never runs out of monsters and foes, you approach combat cautiously. That doesn't mean it's not all about combat. Well, it's not all about combat, but it doesn't mean that combat isn't interesting, or that it's designed to be, a circular saw that just goes through characters. But if you just get in there, and healing is rare in the default game world. So if you go in there and just sort of say, "Oh, I'm gonna wade into the fray," and raw Adam, you're gonna get carved up pretty hard, because it's really designed around fast dueling behavior. The thing that I really like about TFT is that you can play an entire game with no guys in rubber suits or weird monsters or whatever if you want to, and still have it be super interesting, right? It's human. All the bad guys are not human, but it's kind of real world problems with real world solutions. You don't get a lot of, and the Doomsday artifact will destroy the universe, right? You don't get a lot of Thanos and his snap. Type foes. It's the big bad guy of one of the famous locations. He doesn't want to ruin the universe or take over the world. He wants the Duke's job, right? He wants to be the guy in charge. It's not the chortling I'm going to take over the world thing, which has its place, and I've run fun campaigns like that. But it supports a level of visceral play that is very much like low level old D&D, but with more kind of tactical fidelity to it.
I feel like so. I feel like games with like kind of like the old school feel versus the new school. I feel like old school was designed more to challenge the player, where the new school is kind of more designed to challenge the character.
I think there's some truth to that. That's a topic in and of itself.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, in
I,
the
I will.
sense,
I think but no, I understand what you're going there, and there's definitely an element of you need to carefully select the appropriate tactics for the bad guy that you're facing, for the foe that you may not be a bad guy. A lot of it is you can play very effective PvP as a tactical game. But yes, there's a great deal of skill involved in the combat game, but it's one of those games that I like to describe as fractal, in that the rules are not complex, but the emergent behavior of the interaction of the different options provides variety without rules complexity. And Phil and Steve are doing a fantastic job of saying no. We are not saying no. Let's just stay that way. No. Well, I want to add a subsystem. No. I want to do a rules expansion. No. Right? We have a game that works, and it's worked for 40 years. So we're not going to add the equivalent of what you derogatorily call a splat book.
yeah.
We're not going to add, like, for example, I was like, "Hey, you want some grappling rules?" No, we do
Yeah.
not. We have a perfectly acceptable thing that's worked for us for 40 years, so we're not going to go crazy with, "Oh, and here's this new thing." And even my own stuff, when I have a meta rule that I say when I'm doing like when my friend and co-author Kevin Smith wrote Nordlander Folk and Hand of Asgard for me, some Dungeon Fantasy role-playing game products. Um, I have a rule that I send to my authors, which is thou shalt not nerf existing characters. So if you're going to do something and add something cool, a character made before the book comes out shouldn't look at this new book and say, "Well, now my guy's useless."
Yeah, yeah, that's
Right?
very
You want it. You want
problematic.
it's very. It is, and so uh, the thing that TFT is doing very well is saying this is the core. And if you want to do stuff with it, that's great. Write adventures, new interesting monsters, some challenges. There's a really cool expansion that blew out different kinds of undead monsters called the Book of Unlife, um, to provide some subtlety beyond what's there. But what we're not going to do is say, here's the new lost grimoire of spells that if you knew that they existed, you would have never taken anything else. Right? We're not going to do that. And so they've done a really nice job of keeping a game that has been working pretty well for 40 years on track.
Yeah, and that's really a really tough line to walk, just because sometimes design just gets better, right? And
It can. It can. Sometimes design gets different,
yeah,
right?
well, there's that too.
Right. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like one of my favorite games that I rarely get a chance to play is Knights Black Agents, by Ken Hite, which uses the gumshoe system.
Yeah,
And dude, that's a 1d6 roll 4 or higher resolution mechanic, but it's very much. Ken actually explained it to me at Gen Con. I was like, I have a problem mentally with this because after I spend my points, I'm not a good doctor anymore. Right, I have 8 points in doctoring, and I spend my points, and from then on out, I'm no better than Joe Schmo. And he's like, no, 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 that's not how this works. Gumshoe is about TV in a way. You have a certain amount of spotlight time, and you are spending your points to be awesome in that scene. So don't think of it as you're no longer a good doctor. You were the star of the show for that 7 minutes of airtime, and now it's time for your other ensemble people to be highlighted. And I was like, that is unlike anything I've ever heard before. But now that I understand it, it makes sense. It's about choosing your moment to shine. And so, in terms of different game design, it requires a different kind of thinking. And by the way, a really, really good GM, because a lot of the things that you can do in that particular system require a lot of heavy lifting and improv by the game master. It's a fantastic play experience in the right hands, but if you're dealing with someone like me who did not know how to deal with that ooh, danger,
yeah,
danger, danger. But anyway, so that's a system of almost orthogonal design to a GURPS or even a D&D where once you're a weapon master forever, and you are a Cuisinart that goes through all foes that way. And so that's the kind of thing that you have to watch for.
the
Um,
that's the game where you're like agents, right? And
yeah, that one
Dracula.
is agents versus yeah, that's right. Your agents fighting the secret cabal of vampires. And Brian Smith on the question asked about porting uh, bits, and I'll answer that in two ways. Obviously, especially for actually, there's I believe that there's a book coming out from TFT called Old School Monsters, and so with that, you could probably take any of the adventures published um, uh, from me and from TFT, and slide them easily by saying, well, this monster is a lot like this monster in D&D, or this monster in TFT is like this power level or creature in D&D, and so I can just use the stat block, and so run the games that way. And my character collections Kickstarter, launching tomorrow, uh, is NPC after NPC, and because the fantasy trip is fairly simple in its stat presentation, and then you'll have things like talents, sword expertise, farming, detect traps. Well, that's pretty easy to port over and say, what are you good at? Well, I'm a sword master, and I'm kind of sneaky because I have the stealth talent, and so this sounds a lot like a swashbuckler to me. Or in old school, maybe he's a thief, maybe he's a fighter with certain abilities. Conan was a fighter, but he was also sneaky. So from that perspective, uh, TFT, because it's not steeped in rules mechanics, um, it's easy to port the ideas and the plot lines and whatever to other games. I think especially OSR stuff could be done without a lot of work. And the
Yeah,
character, yeah, go ahead.
of the D&D systems, 5e is like the easiest to convert to. But I would just say too, just playing different games, not necessarily with the idea of porting stuff over, just experiencing other games just makes you think about games and gaming differently. And I feel like there's just a lot of value to that in and of itself.
Right, right. No, it is, and then Brian just said, no, it is not called Perilous Personalities, largely because I didn't think about it.
Yeah.
I should have, right? I'm going to rewrite the character. I've got, it launches tomorrow at 10, so I've got 11 hours to change it.
Yeah.
Um, and but that's a good idea. Actually, I really need to use Perilous Personalities as a tagline in my marketing in the next 11 hours.
There you go.
So Brian, you get a quarter every time I say it, to borrow from J. Jonah Jameson, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so these are I think they're a lot of fun. And what they're not, though, is the first 3 volumes. I've got 3 more planned that open up as stretch goals get unlocked. But the first 3 are almost done. I just got so the longest volume is fully done. The first volume is actually done. I released that as a free gift because I felt like my More Perilous Journeys project was going a little long in terms of production. And as I was doing the Sunken Library, I'm like, these characters that I'm writing up would make a nifty, ready to play, grab a bad guy supplement by itself. And so I banged out a quick 8-page, 20 characters, 8 pages, called Character Collections, and I fortuitously called it Character Collections 1. And I was like, there's legs in this, because people responded to it well. I sent it out, 550 free copies of the PDF, and then a few people bought the print copy. But people are like, I like these. These are good. And I'm like, well, I went from this is an idea to I'm ready to spool this out and send it to print in 48 hours, because they just came, right? I mean,
Yeah.
here's this and that. And so I was like, well, let me do more of those, and I hope that people respond to them, because the first 2, the second volume is called Rookies, which provides 40, so it's a little bit longer. Every character has art custom drawn for it. And so the first book was not that way. I used art that I already had. The third book is even longer. It's 20 pages, 72 characters, each with custom art. That one is called Bandits and Outlaws. So 72 characters with ulterior motives of one form or another. But they all have just enough history, right? Tell me about your character. Let me show you my backstory. But they all have, but there's 4 to a page, so you only get enough to hang it on. The characters are something you can grab and go and play. And honestly, I've had enough response to them that I'm deliberating ways of migrating those directly to either OSR or Dragon Heresy or 5th edition, because especially having game aids that take the burden off the game master's time is so important these days, because we're all under so much pressure. But because these are fun to write, so what happens is, if I can market my Kickstarter for a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
The pledges are almost all for digital only, but bear with me on that. For $10, you get character collections 1, 2, and 3, but they're priced as if you get like a 20% discount or 15% discount on only 2 and 3, because 550 people have CC1 and PDF already. But I didn't want to say, oh, here's a really complex pledge tracker. So for $10, you get $15 or $16 worth of PDFs. But as more backers, not dollars, but more backers join, you get books 4, 5, and 6 in PDF as part of that $10 pledge. So if we can get 1,000 backers, you get all 6 PDFs for $10. If you are like many in the TFT community and really like print, all of those are available as add-ons. If you like these kind of quick reference cards that are compatible with Steve Jackson Games' Decks of Destiny, it's the same format, it's the same layout. This is how good they were to me. They let me use their layout, which in graphic design is challenging. But there are cards that are available, and I'm also getting 1-inch square counters for people who like physical stuff made up. So those are all available as add-ons. Steve Jackson Games has also made available to me 50 copies of the Fantasy Trip hardcover book that's only available in the US because hard to ship and expensive. So there is a new to TFT pledge level that gets you the hardcover, print, and this is the only pledge level that has print included in it. Hardcover, character collections 1 through 3 in print and PDF, and the 3 program solo adventures that David wrote, because what's the best way to learn a game? Play it. And you get those in print and PDF as well. And that's a $100 pledge. But it gives you just a pile of material to.
Yeah, that's a stack of books there. That's not bad.
It is a stack of books.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, the basically drop-in content, and which is super valuable. I mean, our own Kickstarter, that's basically what we made is, 55 custom encounters. The hardest part with that was explaining to people, no, it's not 55 fights, right? They're like 55 instances that something happens. Sure, most of them can turn into fights if that's what you want or your players want, right, but that's not like the idea behind it.
That's right.
I think James Introcaso, Sly Flourish, they did Fantastic Lairs, which did really well. Twister Taverns is on Kickstarter now, which is doing really well. But all of these are things that are where you can just like drop them in your game. And we love those as GMs because it's like, ugh, I got a session tonight. I didn't have any time to prepare this week. What am I going to do with these people?
Right, right. And Phil Reed, in his persona as Phil Reed, as opposed to the CEO of Steve Jackson Games, has published some fantastic systemless content, volume after volume, 12 ideas or 100 encounters or whatever. That's the same thing, which is, how to keep a game moving on a time budget. And sometimes it's really the poke of inspiration that helps keep things going. And since I'm getting I see some questions here about inspiration and voice. I'm gonna force this to answer the question that Brian asked, because if he's gonna interact with me, I want to answer his questions, right?
Absolutely.
But he's asking what authors in the genre have inspired you or influenced my voice. I think a couple of things. I have read Vance, and I will say that it was a good learning experience, but I don't know that I would write a lot that way. I really liked The Broken Sword and Three Hearts and Three Lions. You can clearly see the foundation of the fantasy genre in that. One of the biggest inspirations was Elizabeth Moon's, in fantasy at least, was Elizabeth Moon's Deed of Paxenarian, which finally presented a paladin you didn't want to hate. Well, I didn't want to hate. Maybe some other people hated. But it was funny because I don't know if she wrote it this way, but it looks to me like this is my D&D campaign. I start out as a fighter. I go in and become a holy warrior over time. And you can, oh, Pax just leveled up. And so you can see it, but having the world and the background and how do you interact with things. But I gotta say, one of the things that has really influenced my author style has been my publishing style, which I've started to have rules about things like don't give the game master homework. And character collections is an example of that. Don't write um, don't write and the fighter and the party encounters 12 bad guys and just leave it there. Either point to a reference in a monster manual or a book that you've published that conveniently drops those, um, or provide help. It doesn't have to be big help, but don't just sort of say, "Oh, and now the game's going to stop," while the game master scribbles down 12 bad guys.
Yeah.
That's not your job as someone who's taking money for something. So don't give the game master homework. And the other is always, 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 always enable player agency. If you see something where the cool NPC does all the work, you're writing fiction. You're not writing a role-playing game. And those are both valuable contributions to the fantasy milieu and genre. But you're playing a role-playing game, which means that your responsibility is to entertain your friends or help entertain your friends or let them entertain yourself as you take every misstep that they make and punish them for it. Did I say that out loud? I'm sorry.
There's a meme, right? And it's like, I want to play a game of D&D where I write the story and play all the characters or something like that. And then the response is, you mean write a book?
Right, exactly. And so, so a great example of that was I got a manuscript and there was about 1,000 words of a speech. It was exposition where, and now we're going to have the game master is going to read 1,000 words of text. And I was like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. We're absolutely not going to do that.
All in one shot? Was it all in one shot?
Yeah, no, it was the people who were hiring the party were explaining things, and it was needful information. But what I did with that was I said, okay, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. But what we are going to do is take all the important bits of that information and spread it out over town in a rumor table so that the players can go carousing and interact with the setting and learn things by virtue of them going out and finding things out. And that turns into a player directed activity as opposed to 5 of your friends really not paying attention and looking at their cell phones and staring at you with dead eyes as the pizza gets cold.
It's got to be interactive.
It has to be interactive. It is an interactive medium, and so what the thing that you have to be careful about in taking inspiration from books is avoiding the traps of the medium, because there are things that happen in books that only the author can get away with. The great example there that I'd seen was, okay, we're about to take we must hold this course for 40 days, right? We're walking to Karadhas. Well, frick that noise. Gandalf knows the Eagles. Let's get some airlift going on, right? Well, that's the kind of thing that you have to anticipate. And the author, Tolkien, and who's going to argue with him, right? And I know that there are rationalizations for why they had to do that. And, maybe you just can't phone the ring of the Eagles and say, hey, we need a lift. Well, I'm the king of the Eagles. I don't just show up like a taxi.
An Uber.
Right, yeah, it was, I'm, here's Uber service, but in any case, the thing is that there are things that you have to do where you anticipate the most likely course, but you have to leave room for the players to do their own thing. And so what I've found, and I wrote a post on this in my blog, I had taken a management course by the McChrystal Group, General McChrystal from Iraq War fame. When he left the Joint Chiefs, he started a consulting company on teaching people how to think about things. And one of the things that they've done is they breaks down a format about business strategy. And what I did though is I applied that to bad guys, good guys too. But you know, what are they trying to achieve? What are their methods, their motives? What are they willing to do? What are they not willing to do? What is their strategy? And this definition of strategy is, what do they need to win? What do the bad guys need to win? What do they need? Not what they do, that's tactics, but what do they
Yeah, yeah.
need? And once you understand what the bad guys need, you know what they're going to do when the player characters blunder into their plans. If they're not interfering with disrupting what the bad guys need, they're irrelevant. And you can swat them or ignore them or whatever. But once they start interfering with what the bad guys need, and by the way, as a game master, you want them to interfere with what the bad guys need, because then 10 ninjas jump into a room and try and kill the players.
Yeah.
Right? But once you understand what the bad guys need, the game master has the tools to react dynamically. And the other thing that was kind of fun is that in business, you keep score. Revenue, income, people reached, links clicked, amount of good you do the world, whatever your business metrics are, you should have them. And bad guys have them too. If you know, the old saying is, if you can't measure it, it's not going to happen. But it's true. If you're looking to take over the world, because what bad guys do, right? But if you're looking to take over the world,
Or just the tri-state area. It just depends
or
on the
just the
bad guy.
tri-state area, you know. But I mean, so that was a great Simpsons episode. But right, the bad guy was looking to take over the world. He couldn't. But his score was the tri-state area. If I think we're on the same page there.
No, but I think that might be the genesis for. So my kids used to watch this show, Phineas and Ferb, and Dr.
Okay.
Doofenshmirtz. That was his goal, to conquer the tri-state area.
Tri-state area, right?
He was going to conquer the world, but then like their mom
step it back.
went on a date with them early in his life or something. It's like, maybe he needs smaller goals, and that's where he came up with the tri-state area.
But that's exactly the point. Yeah. Is if he's going to engage in conquering the tri-state area, or just engage in taking over the duchy, to bring it back down to a fantasy game, then what does he need? Well, he needs influence, he needs power, he needs arms, he needs mind control, whatever he needs, and that's where you go. And so, but by providing a lot, so my adventures now are all, and I'm starting to give this out to my authors as they write. I'm like, look, these are the things that I'm going to reject, because I'm doing Gaming Ballistic now as my full-time job. I was let go from my disk drive company that I worked for last August, and I looked at my options. I said, you know, let's see if I can make publishing, which I love, my life. And so I finished up More Perilous Journeys, and now I'm doing this for real. But if I'm going to do it for real, I need to provide things that people want, oddly enough. And so my guidance to authors is, make sure that you're a neighbor player agency and write games, not books. And so part of that is my having enough setting information or background that if you're going to interact with this adventure, that you can do it freeform. Don't give me a railroad, because that makes for poor ability for players to do what they want. I just want to answer one more question, because we've talked about writing and stuff. There's a question online saying, what's the value of box text? I actually still use it, even though I just went on a huge diatribe about it. I actually think that the way that I advise people to write if they're stuck with things is, box text or introductory text is really useful for this is the thing that everyone sees as they walk into the room, right? Here's the obvious stuff that I open the door and orc, right? That's what you see. The box text is you see a bad guy and it tries to eat your face. That's all you have time to see when you walk into the room. If you walk into the room and you see furniture and there's some mold on the walls and this, that, and the other thing, okay, lay that out in a few sentences. And then everything else that is not obvious by simply looking, you put in a player agency driven, which means you have to search, you have to interact. You may just have to say, oh, what's in the corner? And you're told what's in the corner. But so I think that there's room for that.
Yeah, it's all about how it's implemented. For a while ago, there was like a debate raging whether we should still be using box text or not. And, I've asked a couple of different people about it. And one of the more interesting responses I got was it's like box text allows me, the author, to tell the GM what was important in that scene. And again, it goes back to like, you don't want 1,000 words of, monologue, but no, just like a quick description of things that for them that they can interact with. And I'm saying, as the writer to you, the GM, these are the things that I think are important for the player, right? And then, you can take your game and do what you want with it.
I agree. And for things where the author is using literary devices like foreshadowing, you might really need to point out the dead corpse in the corner with sucker wounds on it or whatever, because that gives the players a chance to know that Monster X, which has a distinctive signature in how it kills, is waiting for them. And if they ignore that clue, or if they don't use it, they could walk into that and get curb stomped because they haven't exercised due caution and done the hey diddle diddle straight up the middle thing. So there are places for literary conventions in game design, and it's sometimes important to push that at the players, the table, I should say, because it's the game master as well. Because what you never want is to come to a place and say, well, I guess we missed the clue in room 13, so the game is done. That's poor. I mean, it happens all the time in real life, but we are emulating heroic fiction, which means that while the game master can and should punish stupidity, if stupidity is enforced or there aren't 2 or 3 ways to solve a problem, then you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, or hinging it on a die roll. Like, all of those things are just going to bring your game to a grinding halt. In real life, when you have a problem that kind of stumps you or stops you, you can go do something else.
Right.
But when we're playing a game at a table, we're all kind of like, we're here to do the thing. And the thing is not, and the thing is supposed to be fun. And it's not fun if all we're doing is beating our head against the table going, why can't we solve this problem?
Right. And the other thing about that is make sure that your bad guys or your allies are at least relatable. I had one situation where the NPC ally was so annoying that I was like, the players are just going to shank this guy and leave the course of the adventure real fast.
Yeah.
And so, that was the other thing, is if you really want an annoying bad guy, don't put him in the midst of the player characters, because they absolutely will kill him in his sleep.
I was going to say, I am in the middle of reading Monster of the Week, right? And in there's like 6 phases to like writing the mysteries, right? And essentially what it is like, what would happen if this person, like, if this story happened and the players, weren't to do nothing, right? And then you kind of go through those phases, and then kind of like make those things happen if the players don't kind of engage, right? So that so I think that's like kind of like a cool way to do it, and they have like each phase named or whatever. But like, it's basically your story beats, right? And they don't actually involve the players at all, because it kind of goes along with like a philosophy I was introduced to a while ago, and that is, you want to create problems for your players, not the solutions.
That's right. That's right.
like I don't. I've gotten to the point where like instead of having like two or three ways for them to solve the problem, I might have one in mind, but like I backburner that and I just go with whatever the players come up with that seems like the most reasonable. And a lot of times they'll come up with things that are more interesting than the thing that I thought of was.
Right.
So
Right. And I mean, from that perspective, in my both the original and the second edition of Lost Hall of Tyr, as well as the Dungeon Fantasy role playing game version of that, Hall of Judgment, um, it's fine to anticipate. Right? You have a chasm to cross. What are you going to? Well, they could fly. If you have magic, maybe they can fly. So deal with that. Maybe they are going to try and build a bridge. Deal with that. What if they can't and they have to climb down and build a raft? Deal with that. You don't have to anticipate every solution.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, there's going to be things where, in terms of don't create homework for the game master, you're going to want to deal as an author and a provider of materials for ways of moving the game along and helping out things like, uh, crossing a chasm. The flight spell may have a limit on distance, or we're going to fire a tow rope across. If you think that that's a way, put a convenient tree there or something to
yeah.
anchor that, right? But there are things. Actually, that's the big thing that you have to watch out for, and that as an author and as a publisher, I feel you need to look for is I have a problem that can be short circuited, or I have a whole adventure that can be short circuited with this spell. You're gonna need to deal with that, otherwise.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
that,
right.
you know,
You just need to. You need as an author to have enough system knowledge and mastery to understand how this works. And the other thing too that I coach, especially in TFT, which is a very down to earth kind of system, or down to seedery as it may case, you really need to be aware of what magic can and can't do. Because if you're postulating the orb of universal death thing, and the best that the magic can do is light a cigarette, you are significantly altering the flavor of the in-game meta, and probably in a way that is going to seem like cheating, right? You're going to be doing something that is how can I phrase this without being insulting? It's a shortcut.
yeah.
I don't want to use the words lazy writing, so I'll say shortcut. But you really need to know enough about the system that you're dealing with to know that there are some problems that can simply be bypassed, and you need to think through that. And if you're, that's one of the reasons why presenting problems rather than specific solutions is important, because there's almost always a way for someone with good game system mastery to say, poof, not a problem anymore.
I want to jump back to the author question because I know you're a
Yeah,
fan
sure.
of Norse mythos and stuff.
Yeah.
Have you ever read The Last of the Renshai?
I haven't.
Mickey Zucker Reichart
Okay.
is not a super well known author, but she's an awesome writer. And Last of the Renshai is a great trilogy, and I think she did another, at least one more trilogy set in that world.
Okay.
And then she's done some other things that have been really good.
No, that's great. I have been so busy trying to get More Perilous Journeys done, and then start off because I'm a big fan of not starting something until you finish the last thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so now that More Perilous Journeys is done and sent out, I can start new things. But that has occupied almost my every waking moment. I'd be like, if I'm not working on fulfilling More Perilous Journeys, what am I doing then? And so now that is finished, I can make room for other things and not stay up until 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 doing the next thing to fulfill that thing. So I have a chance to take some time to myself. But I am really looking forward to delivering character collections. I'm doing a lot more planning ahead of time to make this a much smoother experience. And I've got some really cool stuff for the Dungeon Fantasy role playing game in the hopper,
Ooh.
which is my Norse setting, right? I've got the big one that's announced already is the Nordland Oveneboken, which is Norse for Nordlander Enemies book. So it's a monster manual for the Dungeon Fantasy role playing game. It's derived from almost 150,000 words of stuff that I wrote for Dragon Heresy, but I couldn't afford to publish. So I've got a lot of monsters, and you'll recognize a lot of them since Dragon Heresy is, I can only call it what it is, a fantasy heartbreaker. It was derived from the SRD, but the SRD has stats and not text, right?
Mhm.
So I had to write all of the fluff text, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, but I had to write all the fluff text. So I've got hundreds and hundreds of setting specific tuning for the Dungeons Fantasy role playing game, plus birds and beasts and stuff that you run into, and I think that people are going to like it. It's going to be a big lift because it could be easily be a 288 or a 304 page hardback.
Yeah.
But I think that it's time to, because I want them on my shelf. I think it's time for just a thunky hardback to show up for the Dungeon Fantasy role playing game, and that's my biggest goal this year after character collections.
Didn't you
Is to
write
get
a
that.
rule set for? I forget what it's called, but I'm sure you'll know. Uh, Basically, like like the Vikings would have these rap battle duels.
Yes, 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 yes. Flighting.
Lighting,
I
yeah.
used to think it was fleeting, and then I found out that I was wrong. Yeah,
Mhm.
so skaldic rap battles appear in the Lokenna saga, where Loki and the gods go back and forth, and it's all verse and kenning, and this basically rap battles. They are contests of insults done in skaldic verse, and you go back and forth, and it's a great little side conversation, side conflict that you can bring, that isn't just I smack him with my sword. And so there are rules for skaldic rap battles in Citadel of Nordvorn. um, and I have a friend of mine who's here in Minnesota, although we don't game together, although I should. He has been running through a lot of my Nordland materials, and his players have really embraced the flighting
Yeah.
rules. And
In my
like,
head canon, in my mind, I just see like the Wild and Out series. I think it was like on MTV or something, and I just but
okay,
envision it with all Vikings. So,
and the anyway. So there's also in the Dragon Heresy game, and I think I'll show this again. There is also rules for the flighting, which you can attack someone's bravery, you can attack someone's reputation, you can attack someone's love life. You can say, your mom dresses you funny, or your manhood or womanhood is not sufficient for the task of
yeah.
pleasing your chosen whatever, and they have to respond. And the higher status of the person, the more barbs, the more effective your insults have to be in order to win, right? Because if they're high status and high reputation, they've gotten that way because everyone knows that this guy is a mighty warrior. So saying, well, this guy is not a mighty warrior, well, he just hewed the head off of a huge demon, so that's not going to work. Anyway, so it's kind of it's a nifty thing. I think it's like 3 pages. It's like, I swear it's like 3/4 of a page because there's a
Yeah.
big piece of art there. So it's short, because as I have matured in my writing, I have realized the importance of spending exactly the minimum number of words to do rules that you need. I used to really suffer from excessive rules creation when I first started my writing career, and I've gotten better at that. It doesn't mean that I don't write rules. It doesn't mean that I don't spend word count on them. But I've gotten better at saying, is there a simpler way to do this? Like, for example, my original technical grappling book was 50 pages long. and fairly confusingly written. Even if I have to give myself not dungeon grappling, that one benefited from learning, but the technical grappling work that I did for GURPS was presented as if you already knew it as a reference book rather than let me teach it to you, and it also just was more. It was presented in a way that was more made it seem more complicated than it was. I revised that to 8 pages long for called Fantastic Dungeon Grappling for the Dungeon Fantasy Role Playing Game. If you got in on the Dungeon Fantasy Role Playing Game box set reprint, it was included in the box. Again, Steve Jackson Games being nice to me, and otherwise you can see it. But it's 8 pages, and you look at it and you're like, this does everything that 50 pages of rules did, and it's clear, it's concise, and you don't suffer from option paralysis. It's just better, and that's just a sign of learning your craft, learning my craft better. And as I've gone on and developed strong opinions about that, I get to not only reflect that in my own writing, but I reflect that in what I make my authors do, who come to work for me, or come to work with me. So
there's something to be said for being concise, for sure. It kind of came up the other day with the age system, where like in the one book there's like 3 charts to choose from when you do a specific thing. In another book there was like 3 charts to choose from per type of action you were taking, right? And then, like, you know, it's like, well, I hadn't experienced the previous game, so I didn't know that. I'm like, oh, so it almost feels like they're like, oh, this was really good here. What if we do even more of it? And it, to me, it was like kind of a step in the wrong direction.
Well, and there's also, I don't want to go long. I mean, are we limited on time here, or?
We're actually just past the hour mark, so we will be wrapping up. But
okay.
There's no time limit.
Yeah, there's no hard. Okay. You know, one of the things that you have to watch for in general is analysis paralysis at the table is hard. What do I do now? You know, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have options. You absolutely should have options on how to solve problems and deal with things. But if you're staring there at 50 different things and it requires 7 years of system mastery in order to know what to do, and if there are right answers, right? If you can choose any one of 4 different options and each of them provides a different kind of fun, that's fine, right? But if you can choose between 4 or 8 or 10 options and there are only 2 of them that are really effective, 5 of them are traps, right? Meaning that you choose this and you get yourself smacked down, that it's a terrible thing, and then the others are meh. That requires a level of knowledge and concentration that can be a burden on newer players or people with different levels of investment. If I'm playing because I've had a rough day at work or a rough week at work or a rough life at work, and I'm just looking to kill things and take their stuff, I don't want to have to deal with 7 layers of meta in order to swing my sword and hit people. And forcing me to do that is going to make me walk away from the table. And both as an author who wants you to buy my stuff, but also as a person who wants to have fun with friends, you don't want your players to be like, you know, I don't want to deal with this. And this is something that, you know, and especially the game master's burden is high enough, right? You don't need to add to it to them where you're really making the game master act as a teacher. You want the rules to be fast enough that they never get in the way of the game, and that's something that you know, it's the old line. I did not have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. So there's a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, and for the same reason, that's also why, like, I like to create problems and not solutions, because, right, like, there's nothing more stressful for the players than having to come up with the right answer for everything that you do instead of a answer.
Right, it's the role-playing equivalent of pixel bitching, right? Where you have to find the one pixel on an old school adventure, the one in an 8-bit adventure game where if you put your sword on that pixel, it unlocks the key to the adventure dragon.
Yeah, for sure. So, since we are past time now, we're going to head on out. Final thoughts before we do?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Gaming Ballistic and my various product lines. I guess what I'd really like to appeal to is please check out my character collection Kickstarter. You know, look at it, follow it, ideally back it. I think there's a lot there for portability. And you know, who knows if things are well received, then turning that into an old school character collection, or I've actually got plans for the Dungeon Fantasy role playing game with this, but that has to wait on something else. But you know, I really appreciate your support. And you know, one thing that I don't know that is appreciated is that as a publisher and an author, you don't actually get a lot of interactive feedback. So if you see something that you like, boy, you know, we'd appreciate it if you'd say something. You know, leaving a review, sharing the campaign, whatever. But you know, a lot of times it's like you bought it, and I'm like, well, I bought your stuff. Isn't that all you need? Well, you know, it'd be nice to say a few things. And it does
No,
offer
that is
yeah,
very common.
yeah.
So
But you know, beyond that, you know, I'd appreciate you checking out the project, and I really appreciate the people who are joining and interacting here on the chat. And beyond that, you know, I hope to come again and have more stuff going on.
awesome, man. Thanks for coming on. As always, folks, in the description, you can find links to follow Gaming Ballistic. Go check Douglas out over there. And until next time, stay nerdy.